Hello everyone, today we talk about the Burgundian state for our historical regional series. We talked multiple times about Burgundy, dedicated videos, however we never made a broader overview about the Burgundian state, so-called state specifically. In fact, I did make another video for the same series about the Duchy of Burgundy, the ancestral lands of the Valois, Burgundy, as vassals of actually part of the same Valois family, in turn also a branch of the Capetians, of course. The difference we will repeat today, but fundamentally it's obvious. Like the Duchy of Burgundy was just one of the French principalities within properly what had been the Western Frankish kingdom, developing at least from within the same. There were other Burgundian territories, so to say, including the Kingdom of Burgundy in the south. It was not France, technically, and also the County of Burgundy in the pertaining to the Eastern Frankish Kingdom. The history of Lotharingia in particular is a bit complicated. That's why we should make a video about that as well. And this is a complication that continues throughout the centuries, in the sense that it's not just foundational, but things kept evolving, as you understand also from the dissolution of same Burgundian state. The term Burgundian state is still a thing historiographically in order to describe the extensive territory known as a whole as Valois Burgundy by approximation. This arose in the late Middle Ages under the rule of the Dukes of Burgundy from the French House of Valois. And this is essentially a complex group of domains, including, in fact, both French and imperial fiefs, as the Valois Burgundy straddled, in fact, across the border between the two powers. So we know the ducal Burgundy, but also the comital one. And then you have the so-called Burgundian Netherlands that take the name after the dynasty, right? Not any, say, ethnic concept stemming from the migration era, which is instead true for the Duchy of Burgundy as well, even though it developed as a feudal polity, as a state, but also one of the best administered, one of the most centralized and up to date since the High Middle Ages. It's important also to stress that this territorial arrangement persisted beyond the original Burgundian dynasty, and the laws by the same, that were essentially the Habsburgs, of the same Duchy of Burgundy itself, that was reclaimed, right? And it's important to stress that, of course, the Burgundian state is not, of course, the Duchy of Burgundy. There are important differences. However, it's also important to stress that the whole system kept being seen, especially by the legitimate heirs, at least by dynastic inheritance, is the Habsburgs, as a whole, right? And it was all an ambiguity regarding to whom the title, say, of Duke of Burgundy pertained, etc. So that's mostly a Renaissance history. We're not going to look at it today. Today we talk medieval history. That's what the series so far has been about chronologically. The importance of the Burgundian state is notorious. This polity was one of the great European powers of the 15th century. The Dukes of Burgundy were considered among the most prestigious, at some point debatably the most prestigious, wealthiest, influential leaders of their time. They were sometimes dubbed as the Grand Dukes of the West. They incarnated the supreme ideal of, say, late medieval chivalry. Think about the Toison d'Or, think about their leadership role during the crusades against the Ottomans. Their centrality in Europe, and we will very much debate this in order to appreciate the essence of the Burgundian state, that I will tell you, I think it is not necessarily overrated in a conventional sense, because Wu does rate it to begin with, but definitely this was not a particularly solid polity, right? It historically came to develop from mostly like the shrinking, the weakening of major states such as France or the same empire towards the later Middle Ages, especially the mid-14th century crisis. In fact, exploiting a vacuum in political power in areas such as, especially the say the Flanders that were sort of decentralized and, however, weak in the sense being, despite of their wealth, very politically divided. The same western parts of Germany, Lotharingia, that, as you know, would not historically develop essentially much of a great power. Most imperial dynasties had tended to shift towards the east. Look at the Luxembourgs that actually originated from the west. They were French speakers of the empire. The Habsburgs themselves would end up inheriting instead this Burgundian legacy. So it's a very complicated and fascinating topic. We have already had the privilege of looking at more in-depth aspects, for example, of the Burgundian administration and how, say, in fact, the dukes could aspire even to control such importantly, not just fragmented, but also quite heterogeneous part of Europe. However, also among the most developed, depending on what we're looking at. We've seen, for example, in the video about the Duchy of Brabant, how powerful that state really was. It was actually the most important after Burgundy. You have Flanders, that again is one of the richest regions in Europe. Then there are also many different and also small feudal states that were agglutinated through different policies, war, outright conquest, in fact, marriages, diplomacy, by the Valois Burgundy that managed to, in fact, compact all this territory, taking advantage of so many different dynamics. Again, the crisis of princely Germany, the 100 Years' War, and in fact also some external support, such as the English one against the French. We almost deal with the Burgundians as if they were anything other than the same French, but this is exactly how they sort of posed themselves towards what would remain essentially the state of the French crown, even though the same Burgundians were so closely related to the monarchs. In fact, could aspire simply to even unite all this massive French dominion. Things went in another direction, and not without many feuds and struggles and bloodshed also at a royal, princely level. So you have this very developed polity, becoming also a vital center for trade and commerce, a hub of courtly culture, especially setting trends for royal households across Europe. And this Burgundian state, as we will see now, was a historiographical invention of modernity, right? It wasn't known like that at the time, especially not in a traditional sense. I mean, it was just a sum of dynastic domains. It wasn't considered as a whole. However, by approximation, was, let's say, inspiring to become that to a degree. In fact, it almost transformed into an actual kingdom, institutionally, internationally recognized as such, especially during the last true, let's say, Valois Burgundy ruler, that is Charles the Bold, right? And especially for those who are interested in military history, the great question is, why did the Burgundians lose to the Swiss so badly? What's behind that? There's a lot about it, actually. I talked a bit about this, especially in the early days of Schwerpunkt. There is a medieval Burgundy playlist that sort of actually puts together a bit everything, in fact, should create one about the Burgundian state in general. But aside from the strictly military dimension, I think that what I said before is valid, that in spite of the enormous power and influence and capacity of the Valois Burgundy and their domains, the actual solidity of the latter was precarious, was more ephemeral than, in fact, especially the one of the French crown. That is essentially also what you see in later history. In fact, towards the east, right? Germany does remain that fragmented. The major powers are, in fact, further consolidated in the east, as we were pointing out before, and the French would keep trying to expand, despite being countered effectively, actually, to some extent, by basically a large coalition that, in part, was revived, of course, with different players and different circumstances, but in fact from other continental, also insular powers, because of essentially hegemonic role that France was playing intermittently in European history. And so Charles the Bold, as you know, died at the Battle of Nancy against the Swiss. This dashed his ambitions in Lotharingia, passing his legacy to the House of Habsburg through the marriage of his daughter Mary to Maximilian of Austria. Hence, Philip the Fair and Charles V, and so all the major, all the other great major, let's say, marriage policies and, in fact, dynastic accumulation of the Habsburgs that we discussed in a bit in particular. To Felix Austria Nube from the Habsburgic series playlist. At the same time, of course, what had been the wall of the Burgundian state was essentially carved up. The Saint Duchy of Burgundy fell under the control of the Kingdom of France, that deliberately chose to invade it and conquer it. There could have been a French marriage with Mary, right? But the thing would have dragged on a bit, like, for example, the Duchy of Bretagne would. Also, Picardy was taken over. The French would keep pressing in that direction later on, also during the Italian wars, etc. But we will see this in another video. Again, we talk mostly about medieval history here. There is also no need to, in fact, discuss the wall issues with Charles V at that time. The passage of the Burgundian Netherlands in 1555, that is at his abdication under control of the Spanish Empire ruled by King Philip II, then the Dutch Revolt, the 80 Years of War, and so was also pertains, in fact, at that point, mostly to the history of the Low Countries, with the Dutch Republic, etc. Then what essentially the Valois Burgundy had been about, because by that point, not just the Dutch began to rule themselves with their own dynasty and so on, but they literally seceded from the same Holy Roman Empire. So the concept of a Burgundian state is, however, interesting to briefly analyze, as we use it due to the first introduction made of it in the 19th century by the famous Belgian historian Henri Pirenne, the one of the Pirenne's thesis, Mr. Rain. We discussed that importantly. He wrote in his Histoire de Belgique about this, essentially in his view that was essentially nationalistic, the precursor to the Belgian state. All right. So there is no need now to criticize the nationalistic perspective. It's time in particular in historiography, etc. The interesting aspect of this is how, of course, there was no, in that case, for example, Belgian claim to a derivation, say, from a Burgundian ancestry, for example, nor the actual, let's say, application of superimposition, in fact, of the Belgian identity per se to the entirety of the Burgundian state. So it's actually not a bad definition per se. It just stemmed terminologically from particular times, but the event was an intelligent historian. Later, in the early 20th century, the famous Johann Huizinga, that we also criticized at some point, he famously wrote many works like, I don't know, The Autumn of the Middle Ages, etc., resumed the same perennials term. There have been other authors very recently that used it again, so it's not a very controversial definition at all, especially if you intend state as a term, also as it was being developed at that point in essentially the Renaissance and the new political theory and language of the time. Think about Machiavelli, think about others. So the importance here is to emphasize the fact that this conglomeration was glued together by some factors that in some provincial cases, like in fact the same Low Countries, helped fostering a national identity, right? Today we will partially just see this because we'll focus mostly on the evenemential side of the story. But it is absolutely true that especially during the 15th century, the Netherlands, that up to that point had not broadly meant, like, so the Low Countries, not talking about the modern country of the Dutch only, but, you know, the same, say, the Benelux area and beyond, was not really provided with much of a great cohesion, right? It was a cluster of so many different politics, in fact, that we have covered one by one. This is very interesting to look at. And that essentially Valois Burgundy, that coming from a French mentality, was much more statally oriented at that point. I mean, France being the largest state in Europe and having also a great monarchic tradition, as you know, reinforcing that, forced, of course, in this great struggle for political control and administrative rationale, etc., to especially administrate the Low Countries in their, especially in their economical potential, in their urbanization, etc. And so the great interest that these rulers had, especially in the local trade and wealth, and so tax collection, etc., to homogenize the local governmental practice, therefore compacting truly in the Low Countries a sense of identity that does really stem in a national sense largely from that point in history. That's not wrong at all, except in this sense it has not much to do with the Duchy of Burgundy or other parts of the Burgundian state, in fact, that say laid in, say, otherwise in today's Germany, but also more far away from properly the sense of Low Countries, or otherwise laid more like from the still Flemish, but also eventually more French influenced side of the story. So it's actually a complicated story. I talked a lot about Low Countries, and I want to come back on that because it's a very important area for so many political, military, and cultural reasons to explore. I think also that, if anything, this is what I still, the only sort of Belgian perspective we can criticize is how that I encounter still today is this sense of nationhood at some point brought to put at the center Belgian history, however, without much comparison with the rest of European history. And one of the issues with this is, for example, think about the Battle of Kortrijk. We made a video about that. It's a hell of a battle. It's basically the most important infantry victory of that fortunate series occurring in the first half of the 14th century against cavalry, and in particular the very flower of French cavalry that is enormously celebrated, of course, in Belgian national historiography. That, however, basically masks the fact that aside from Mont-Pével, that was a sort of draw and barely, in fact, a Flemish victory, which admittedly the King of France was about to get killed, but still not accomplishing that clamorous victory. The entire Flemish military history from that point to the beginning of the 14th century onwards until the late of 15th, that is the Battle of Guinegate, when the Habsburgs also arrived, trying to apply some Swiss military model, is essentially a total series of complete military disasters of the Flemish armies, especially at the hands of the same knightly, feudal, courtly, chivalric Franco-Burgundian culture that, far from, as people believe, being, stopped by the infantryman, warfare was changing, cavalry was declining. I don't want to use, vulgar terms, but, broke in half, like all the time, the Flemish armies that were composed exactly in the same way of Kortrijk, and that's how they remain, except some increase in artillery that, in fact, would not help more than much. If anything, that part of artillery mostly helped the same Valois Burgundy to foster the largest in first and foremost artillery park in Europe in the 15th century, at least to that princely degree that would become so necessary for everybody, even before the French, that, as you know, would later become properly, like we're talking about, the French Crown Army. So renowned for their artillery. Look at the Italian wars, etc. We are starting to cover some aspects of early modern warfare that finally allows us to know, at least in Schwerpunkt's way, what we're talking about. So that is actually the point. Admittedly, Belgian and Dutch researchers tell us very clearly in their scholarship that yes, the Burgundian state was just this really collection of princely estates rather than a cohesive state whatsoever. It's not a surprise. It's just important to get the narrative right, and there are so many other titles aside from Burgundian state that were used. But I think that this is sort of the more conventional, so the better applicable. The Burgundian state was a personal union of territories under the distant authority of the Duke. This is a good definition. Always bearing in mind that, yes, there are sort of shaded boundaries in this. The individual provinces did not share a unified legal framework. Right, the dukes did establish some common institutions exactly to fix that, and so orientatively, had, let's say, the Burgundian state existed in a vacuum, it would have eventually compacted, but obviously the fact that it didn't is what we are historically interested in, rather than any what if. So the only sort of common communal definition of that could overlap with this Burgundian state actually used at the time was the lands and estates of the Duke of Burgundy. All right, and not in this sense as just the Duke of Burgundy, because the Duke of Burgundy was such because of the Duchy of Burgundy. That was not, however, something that simply proclaimed as a state the superiority or the possession on another state. It's a really personal dynastic idea that this guy was a great lord, and by approximation, he could use his greater title for other, for defining the entire thing. Think about, there are other examples of this, Sardinia, Piedmont, right? It was the kingdom of Sardinia. It was more important in the Holy Roman Empire, but obviously it was a Piedmontese power, Sardinia not being that relevant by the time. This title was still used, right? So we're talking more or less this kind of formality. There is no doubt that the last dukes of Valois, in particular, sought to unite the various communities around symbols that created almost a mystique of, in fact, the Burgundian legacy that especially survives in, for example, in Spain, right? It still has the same cross of Burgundy from exactly that Habsburgic legacy. The Order of the Golden Fleece, that again is the like the top notch chivalric standard ever. As you know, the story comes from the Golden Wheel, the Jason, the Argonauts, and so on. We'll talk about the Golden Fleece better in some other video. Have to keep talking, especially about tournaments, so military orders. There is a lot of Burgundian history there. Now, under Charles the Bold, who aspired to create his kingdom, veritable kingdom of Burgundy, propaganda had already begun to emphasize that the Belgae were the common ancestors of all his domains, which is, of course, a contentious claim, considering that not just, of course, a big deal of ethnic things had changed historically from the Romans to the Germans, but it could, of course, it stemmed from also like a broader humanistic, classical sounding and slightly post-traditional sense of, this more national basis to need to found like a regional power. Nevertheless, if you look at the ancient Belgica province, it was huge, right? And the boundaries do follow something that is comparable, that is similar to what, for very different reasons, of course, throughout the Middle Ages, that Burgundian state had come to exist. But there are symbols, in fact, that stem from the later Middle Ages, such as the Leo Belgicus, as a symbol of unity for the Low Countries, that, as you know, follows literally the shape of the country as a lion, that remained also later during the Dutch Revolt, and so, in addition, the Burgundian state was not even a legally recognized sovereign entity, right? The Duchy of Burgundy was part of the French kingdom. The other territories in the empire were part of, in fact, were imperial vassals. So, if anything, we will understand better now, if those who already know the story. It was mostly this vacuum, this sort of potential as a buffer state, and any kind of other political balance, still quite fragmented Europe after all, politically wise, that allowed for a while this Burgundian state to act as de facto as an independent power. While the emperor's authority was largely theoretical, especially at that point with the explosion of the German national monarchy in the 13th century, in many of their French fiefs, the ducal prerogatives over some domains could be questioned before the Parlement of Paris. This is the reason why, for example, Charles the Bold would establish the Parliament of Mechelen, say, look, we're really something different. We are essentially moving in that direction. Consider at that point, the 100 Years' War, as we'll see better now, was over. So it was evident that the French crown, albeit temporarily weakened, also after its final victory by the great fort sustained, was, as it would do historically, in fact, with Saint Dutch of Burgundy, recover a great part of what had previously lost, also because of the Burgundians that had sided with the English, etc. So there is, of course, a mythology revolving around especially the later national developments in the Low Countries, and so this hypostatization of a polity that never quite really existed in the modernistic and secularistic sense, that in fact it did not have anything to do at the time, but there was tendency towards political compaction, sort of territorial strengthening as a great regional power, which was more or less essentially what the greatest European states were heading at the end of the Middle Ages. So looking at the history proper, the Duke Philip I of Burgundy died in 1361. This was also one of the most eventful episodes in late medieval history, because had things gone differently, the so-called Burgundian state could have existed earlier, and it could have been even larger. Right? We explained this in the video about especially the Duchy of Burgundy, because that's where it had stemmed from through this matrimonial, this dynastic legacy, matrimonial policies that would have allowed this Philip of Rouvroux to get, in fact, everything sooner. Right? That would have also really changed European history in a massive way. The mid-14th century is really the time in which many dynasties actually die out, like in this case. And so there is a recompaction at the matrimonial level because you have less people, but the territories, less heirs, let's say, but the territories remaining the same. Hence also this process of recompaction, paradoxically, during the time of crisis. Remember that the mid-14th century witnesses this phenomenon. There is a shrinking in the absolute power of countries, but let's say together with the fall of universal powers, you have a much greater recompaction and rationalization in the actual territorial powers at the local level, right, at geographical level. So what actually happened in 1361 is that the Duchy of Burgundy was absorbed into the royal domain of King John II of France. This was very important because the Duchy of Burgundy had actually developed some prerogatives on its own, such as the fact it could have not been reunited to the French crown. At the time, with all the difficulties of the 100 Years' War, etc., the King of France had barely an actual control on the duchy, so that the same John, that by the way was, as you know, he had been captured. Here we are after the Battle of Poitiers, so that I also made a video on the monarchy was really in trouble. This is how the Valois Burgundy house began, because John grants the duchy as a fief to his youngest son, also named Philip, like the first, the earlier ruler, and we're talking about the Philip the Bold, right? Philip the Bold, that was formally recognized as Duke of Burgundy and first peer of France on June the 2nd, 1364, which largely allowed him, in fact, a virtually independent rule over these lands. In fact, an enormous power. The same year, there were some matrimonial issues brewing because of all this dynastic, this competition for inheritance more than else. The son of Edward III of England, Edmund of Langley, became engaged to Margaret of Flanders, that was the daughter of Count Louis II, thus the heiress to Flanders, but not only, Artois, Rethel, Nevers, and the Free County of Burgundy. And that's actually part of the territories that would have been inherited by Philip of Rouvroux already at that time, had he not died, in fact, also as a young man of illness. At that point, the situation was very delicate, because had the English basically inherited Flanders, things would have been terribly complicated for France, even more than they already were. And so, of course, we should see in part how the bond would have come to be, that the Flemish wanted to fundamentally remain autonomous and independent. Up to this point, they had managed to, in fact, escape what was initially actually the French, the legitimate French rule that had fought against and partly defeated toward it, but they ultimately really lost the war. So, given that France was exhausted and also that the 100 Years' War was beginning, etc., what really happened is that basically feudal, so that the comital power on the land that the local towns had managed to temporarily shake almost completely off from was reinstated. There was a lot of power sharing and infiltration, especially from England, whose economy, as you know, was deeply intertwined with Flanders. It was one of the big reasons behind the 100 Years' War. And of course, they would have retained a degree of autonomy. And also the fact that England at this point was not able to simply step in and take everything over is relevant to perspective, because this is what the Burgundians instead will do. And as I was saying before, they will literally crush the Flemish. Right? This is the part of the story that it's sort of like it's, I don't know, being proud of English independence, yes, but without considering that actually we're conquered by the Normans entirely. So a bit like the point before with the sort of the ancestry of the Belgians. Yes, that happened because still, of course, the local politics were continued under the rule of the new conquerors, but it's basically because of the latter that you even had that kind of unity and compaction, at least to the extent that it's not like it couldn't, in absolute terms, develop later, but that surely would have not developed that fast and that concretely, even through that, or even especially because of that iron fist and that actual defeat of the same countries. This is the point. The Low Countries at this point collapsed. It was a major financial crisis, all connected essentially with the political weakness of the system, the fact that they in fact had refused to become a state, to be something more united. And Flanders, in spite of those victories against that actual single victory against the French, not just they lost the war, but eventually were taken over literally and completely by the Burgundians. At that point, Pope Urban V was siding the French. So since Edmund and Margaret were cousins, they would have needed a papal dispensation in order to get married, and this papal French alliance prevented that from happening. Rome refused that marriage to be granted, so that Margaret ended up to marry Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. Charles V was his brother, right? So that was a great move, but as we've seen, Philip was, the Duke of Burgundy, and so this allowed for that potential that had already presented itself a few years before to compact de facto and largely like the mass of what would become the Burgundian state from a political, feudal, and sort of roughly geographical point of view, right? And Margaret's father, the Count of Flanders, consented to marry his daughter to Philip. That's how the wedding took place on June the 19th, 1369, in Ghent. That, as you know, is the most important of the Flemish cities, mostly Ghent, Brugge, and Ypres. Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres, if you prefer the French. And that was to, in fact, create a truly new center of power in the north because of this Burgundian connection. Philip became closely aligned with his father-in-law's reign that still, in fact, was effective. So he hadn't inherited the whole thing. But in order to reinforce what would have become, in fact, his inheritance at that point, he defeated a Flemish revolt at the famous Battle of Rosebeek, that in many ways marks that greatest, like the bloodiest defeat of the Flemish against this de facto French domination over them. It was quite robustly enforced on them at this point. Major collapse on their side, major Burgundian success. By the way, the Count Louis died shortly afterward, which meant that on January 30, 1384, Philip, as Count Consort of Flanders, Artois, Rethel, Nevers, and Burgundy, was really one of the most powerful men in Europe. The defeat of the Flemish revolt had also brought to the Peace of Tournai in 1385. In the same year, the offices of Chancellor of Burgundy and Chancellor of Flanders were combined so that the country could be ruled in a more unitary fashion. So you understand immediately the direction there, right? These are the major. This is the major axis, the dichotomy within the Burgundian state. Essentially, Duchy of Burgundy was an incredibly tidy, rich, well-administered, very centralized polity. They had the dukes had basically allowed for the recognition of the fact that they should have succeeded one another without splitting the duchy among the various heirs. That would have been compensated with some pension. Otherwise, this is how this had become one of the single most powerful principalities in France. It was essentially modeled after the Ile-de-France from an institutional administrative point of view, and the Burgundians were extremely jealous of these prerogatives. And from there, so it was a very safe, well, also sheltered power, because the Burgundians didn't really have any major enemy around. If anything, it was Paris, the greater problem, because of their centralistic attempts. But at this point, as we've seen, the Burgundians had much room for maneuvering, as the French crown was a pretty sovereign state, and the main center of Burgundy was Dijon. From there, the main problem was to control Flanders, that had all an autonomous tradition, were, yes, crushed as we've seen, but lacked in fact a uniform, homogeneous administration. And what could be squeezed out of that, just looking at the wealth of the Flemish towns, was enormous, really, for especially the North Sea traffics and more. Two chambers of accounts for this were created. One in Lille, so in the north, and the other one in Dijon, so that they could essentially cooperate with one another in order to become ever more efficient from an administrative tax collection point of view. This tells you how powerful already the Valois-Burgundy house really was. Philip the Bold pursued an ambitious marriage strategy that extended to the east. In fact, his eldest son, you know that the Burgundians follow one another in sequence with the firstborn son and heir, like they are easy to remember, to just four. So John, it would be John the Fearless, married Margaret of Bavaria. So you immediately understand there was an imperial interest of some sort. Philip's daughters, Margaret and Catherine of Burgundy, wed respectively William, the Count of Hainaut. Still haven't talked about Hainaut, but it was one of the major fiefs in the Low Countries, and also the historical rival with Brabant, the more powerful one. Hainaut, Holland. We made a video about Holland and Zeeland that we haven't, but still, it's part of this whole system is gradually amalgamating. And Leopold IV, the Duke of Austria, respectively. So again, yet the reinforcement of that case already an Habsburgic connection that is thus not new by the time of Mary of Burgundy. Now, Philip's youngest son, Anthony, married Jeanne of St. Paul, that was the daughter of Valerian III of Luxembourg. This was yet another polity we have to look at, but again, yet another important pawn in the Low Countries. Throughout the reigns of Philip the Bold and his son John the Fearless, loyalty to the King of France remained robust. At this point, there wasn't much of an antagonism between Burgundy and the French crown per se. On the contrary, the sense was that, of course, it was a great opportunity to be part of the same royal family, and therefore also competing with one another, but still, of course, having much power to leverage, also in a lawful, like legitimate way within the French institutions. But anyway, in such a difficult time, which you could, of course, would give each other a tough time. The Valois Burgundy, of course, saw like a primary duty of theirs to really a crucial obligation to serve the French monarch. They had much to gain from that. Remember, they come from the same blood of the guy that basically was captured by the English after the Battle of Poitiers. Like maintaining France as a wall system was much more advantageous than parceling it later. In fact, what starts happening afterwards is mostly due to an internal, an infight within the same French monarchy that, of course, the Burgundians called the English into because, of course, of the parallel war that was going on, but not much for destroying the wall system, rather reinforcing in that moment their own domains. Yes, of course, at the great detriment of the French kingdom, that, however, was stronger, in fact, than all these blows, as times would prove. In any case, during the regency of his nephew, the King Charles VI, Philip participated in a so-called government of the uncles, essentially serving alongside his brothers that were Louis, the Duke of Anjou. These were all essentially peers of France, John, the Duke of Berry, and Louis II, Duke of Bourbon. They all had their own states within France and participated to this power sharing. As you know, Charles VI is a very famous ruler for very infamous reasons, and specifically the fact that he was mentally ill. He had, for many reasons, like a mental breakdown, after which he basically exhibited signs of madness and was unfit for the rule, which opened to this de facto regency. He had come to power at the age of 19 in 1388, but he would abdicate 4 years later because of this issue of his. Literally, he was even loved actually by the French, because he was treated a bit like a child. Like, even that he literally was out of himself. He did very strange things. Charles, now perceived as mad, was put aside fundamentally, and the Duke of Burgundy effectively assumed at this point as essentially the most important prince of France, the actual power of the realm. Louis I, Duke of Orleans, however, was another very powerful competitor who, by gaining influence, reduced the one of Philip, who died in 1404. So John the Fearless, his son, succeeds him on the ducal throne of Burgundy. John's main goal at this point was to regain control of the regency, given that Charles VI was still there, and so there was a room for it, especially considering that Louis of Orleans at this point was really dissatisfying the subjects. Louis aimed also to renew the war with England, and was rumored to even have had an affair with the French Queen Isabeau, the wife of Charles VI. That's how they started going at one another, until John finally decided to kill his rival. That was in fact murder on November the 23rd, 1407, in the streets of Paris. It was one of the most gruesome episodes of political manslaughter, assassination. Not even, it was done in plain sight. The death of Louis, of a very powerful Louis of Orleans, marked the onset of the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War. The Armagnac were specifically the party that had supported Louis, and of course the Burgundian one was death of John the Fearless. John remained, thanks to this assassination, in power until 1413, when the Armagnacs' forces managed to recapture Paris, from which he was, in fact, ruling within still essentially a French dimension. As you know, these are crucial years for the 100 Years' War, given that the English defeat the French at the Battle of Azincourt, 1415. Henry V has essentially resumed hostilities against France exactly because John, at that point, having lost Paris, wanted to weaken the Armagnac power and let essentially the French lose. At least, the Battle of Azincourt is one of the great veritable miracles, right, of Saint Crispin. We had never made a bit about the Battle of Azincourt, but nor about Henry V, right, and one of the great English warrior kings. But of course, that was in many ways, it would have not been such a great battle otherwise if the English had not been in great inferiority to an extent, and so instead managed to score this astonishing victory that brought de facto the English and the Burgundians to reduce the French, at that point, like the continuity of French power, that is to say, the one incarnated by the Dauphin of France and essentially the Armagnacs that supported him, that, as you know, took place in Orléans. Like, that's what was the main center, as you know, also we've seen now with the war against the English, the coming back with Jeanne d'Arc, etc. John the Fearless retakes Paris in 1418 as a consequence. The year after, as you understand, this was a pretty messed up situation because at a point also the English literally ruled in Paris. The Burgundians themselves were not simply happy that the English were there, but their clash against their kin were more important to them. The Armagnacs and the Burgundians, albeit because of the pretty dire situation, had signed a peace, went at war against one another when on September the 10th, 1419, during a meeting between the Duke and the Dauphin on the bridge at Montereau, John the Fearless was assassinated. This was an even bloodier display than the assassination of the Duke of Orléans, because they literally met, and they were, especially John was essentially hoping things to go well. So he was slain on the spot, and this was the degree of tension and hatred and exacerbation of whole conflict. Seeking revenge, the new Duke of Burgundy, that was Philip the Good, right, 23 at the time, allied with the English once again. And so, as regent, he compelled King Charles to sign the Treaty of Troyes. Charles reigned for a very long time. Again, he was not much of of an active figure anymore, but he was still the king, and so it was useful as a pawn and as a puppet in this way. What this treaty enacted was effectively the disinheritance of Charles' son in favor of Henry V of England, who was to marry, however, Catherine of Valois. This would have fundamentally united the houses of France and England. However, the same Henry V died in August 1422. And 2 years later, the same Charles VI dies. So this changes the whole picture. Is, in fact, the moment in which the defunct Charles, now the King Charles VII, rises. Well, we made a video about Charles VII. And so this is, it's fundamentally starting from almost at least his reign, that things start going worse for Burgundy. And these preconditions, of course, had already alienated a great deal of the Burgundian faction, and so all their domains from the French crown's destiny. Henry V and Catherine of Valois had become in fact Henry VI as king of, at that point, both of France and England, right? So that had been the general purpose. But he was a minor, of course, and John, the Duke of Bedford, assumed the regency. This is also when quite interesting things happened in Paris under the English rule, such as the further development of the two bodies funerary ritual that had started in England, as a matter of fact, and would become instead better known at the French court. Kantorowicz wrote beautiful pages in this. In any case, the situation was so unstable. Like, it happened on multiple occasions during the 100 Years' War to have these minorities of ineffective rulers, great sort of pauses in between. But now the situation was different, because the English still had this major foothold in France, in northern France, effectively ousting the legitimate ruler, at least from the other side perspective, on the same de facto capital of the kingdom. The Burgundians still siding with the English, essentially to maintain the situation frozen and hoping in some broader deal that could favor them at a point of knocking out the Armagnac. But that's when the epopee of Joan of Arc and the rule of Charles VII allowed for powerful coming back of the Armagnac. Charles was crowned in Rheims, according to the great tradition of the French monarchy, the Holy Anointing and more, in this beautiful location, its cathedral, in July 1429. That was the symbol of the mystique, of the continuity of the French monarchy. It's essentially imperial character, and so the fact that the Armagnac coming back was, pretty consistent, especially after the victory against the English at the siege of Orléans was broken, in fact, by Joan, that, however, was later captured by the same Burgundians and handed over to the English that, as you know, made an example of her in Rouen, burning her at the stake. Now we never talk about Joan of Arc, but that's really one of those figures you want to appreciate, especially considering how intricate the situation overall really was. By this point, by the way, the French had somehow even not quite wanted this to happen, but they were negotiating with the English, and there was a war to be fought and won as it would. In 1435, the Congress of Arras was convened, resulting in a reconciliation between Burgundy and France. The latter, which was regaining terrain, was closer to victory, so the Burgundians thought well to, at that point, settle with their own power that had kept extending through all those expansions, marriages, agreements, and so on, especially in the east, in the imperial part. And Duke Philip the Good, for this reason, acknowledged from the other side Charles VII as King of France, who in turn recognized, in fact, Burgundy's territorial claims. As we've seen in the video about Charles VII, we will have to make others, because that mostly covered the latter part of the reign when he had stabilized. But we have seen there that was in fact the moment of stabilization of the fact of the French crown under the Valois, and not yet the actual territorial recomposition of France that would instead occur under his son Louis XI, that at that point also spent, as we will see now, his share of time at the Burgundian court, who was at odds with his father. So there is an interesting history there. That was the only true Dauphin, at least in the sense that ruled from the Dauphiné. We made a video about the Dauphiné, also explaining his role there, and how, in fact, intertwined it was with the same Burgundy. Now, Philip the Good was personally exempted from paying homage to the king. This is a very important condition, at least lack of condition, at the Congress of Arras, which shows how powerful during all this critical phase of the war Burgundy had consolidated to as a power, to the point it could be considered almost like a different state from France, even though under no feudal law this was simply accepted. It was just a favor that mostly these sovereigns, especially like so much soaked in chivalric and courtly culture, like were mostly doing ad personam to one another. All right. So after they were of same blood and they had good reasons to try to stabilize things and giving something in exchange. After the Congress of Arras, Philip the Good predictably shifted his focus away from French affairs, so that the opportunity to simply seize power in France was lost there, and he had rather to concentrate on his own territories as their sovereign, and try in fact to compact them, especially now that France was doing the same, and also for a much better position. At least the war was far from being over, and especially Burgundy, Brittany, and other French principalities could still and would still fight against the crown. Nevertheless, the greater achievements of Burgundy were, in fact, in their own domains. Philip the Good successfully expanded the Burgundian state in the Low Countries. Further, in 1421, for example, he purchased the county of Namur. We will talk about this from the financially troubled marquis that effectively sold this principality, conferring to Philip the outright ownership of the same in 1429. In 1430, Philip inherited the Margrave of Antwerp, and crucially, this was really the major step, the Duchess of Brabant. Brabant was the most important state in the Low Countries. It was the better administered. It was sort of the Duke of the Duchy of Burgundy of the North. All right, of all the smaller, in fact, Low Countries realities, there was Limburg, Luxembourg that also are acquired in this year, thanks to Philip's succession to his cousin, the son of Anthony of Burgundy, because within these houses all the cadets followed, of course, pursued other policies, mostly this marriage was of inheritance. Philip also took advantage of a succession crisis to position himself as the heir of Jacqueline of Hainaut, another great principality. She died in 1433, so that Philip seized her counties, Hainaut, Holland, and Zeeland. Finally, in 1441, Philip acquired the Duchy of Luxembourg from his aunt, Elizabeth of Görlitz. Ultimately, the Low Countries were united by the Valois Burgundy. This is the moment in which that sort of proto or outright sort of national identity of the Low Countries started emerging, because the Valois Burgundy start treating all these principalities of the various communes, etc., as a whole, right? To again homogenize, rationalize the government, the administration. We observed this also from some videos about the organization of the Burgundian army, that essentially is the best, is one of the the best litmus test to check like the political and social background of such forces. You had, for example, like normally the Burgundy pursued the development of a feudal army of sort with lots of mercenaries as well, but in fact, in this case, for example, resulting from a mix of feudal levies, or at least say the equivalent that through the monetization, especially from the 14th century, of this service had now become like a professional soldier, mercenaries if you want, that were bought, in fact, with the money of this enormous territory, especially the great financial resources could be taxed by of Flanders could be taxed by the dukes. Then you have communal militias from Flanders at large that are a bit all, in fact, heterogeneous. They're not as uniformed as, in fact, especially the ordinances of Charles the Bold show us in the later times, but that they provided a lot of guns, right? Yes, not really uniformed, not really like like these are the first attempts to bring large masses of cannons together thanks to this massive princely force. But that, you see, were a bit like the best, especially from a technical point of view, that the Flanders could provide. And that alone hadn't really been useful per se, but united with the Burgundian men-at-arms and their retinues really were quite effective. You know that, for example, England would later buy a lot of artillery from Flanders, but in the same way, they had a great material culture, in part, arms, armor, etc. So mercenaries mostly from Germany, etc. So the Burgundian state was, especially at this point, beginning to recompact itself along the pattern of some sort of more unitary power. Under Philip the Good, the Burgundian court reached new heights, becoming a major artistic center thanks to Philip's patronage. Like the House of Burgundy is really characterized by a great mecenatism and a great sense of, again, courtly chivalric standards. For example, like tournaments, especially in the newly regulated vogues of the time, really are a major Burgundian accomplishment. You have some of the greatest knights of the time being hosted and performing these de facto spectacles, but were connected with, in fact, great political ambition. You have Jacques de Lalande, you have some of the greatest knights of the era really participating. This is also, again, like the era was likely before actually the era of Nicopolis. The idea of crusade, of the Burgundians aimed at Jerusalem themselves. Like they really had acquired that sense of international reputation that would allow them to even claim such crowns for themselves. That's what they really lacked, aside from the ducal, title. And so this virtually already royal standards. Celebrations and banquets in Burgundy gained international acclaim. It was a specific Burgundian etiquette. We talked about the establishment of the prestigious Order of the Golden Fleece, which occurred in 1430, and that would remain, a hallmark of chivalry from there on. Philip the Good became a prominent figure in Christendom, especially noted for his repeated calls for a crusade against the Ottoman Empire, particularly during the Feast of the Fezzan. So we're talking about enlightened sovereigns with great sense of themselves, very high reputation, were rivaling, in fact, with their same French kings that were the most powerful rulers in Europe by that point. Historically, their culture, their language, their uses were the same, but Burgundy implemented them further, right? In spite of this, there were the aforementioned shortcomings. For example, the increasing centralization of power under the House of Burgundy was met with resistance from the Flemish cities. Indeed, it was too early to simply say, okay, well, we can do whatever we want with you. No, of course, the Dukes of Burgundy were quite aware of the Flemish autonomies and liberties. These peoples had always been jealous of those, given that they had always enjoyed this peripheral position among great powers, and or in fact also distant from them. And so such prerogatives had been evaluated, but at the same time it was obvious that the dukes would push for more power concentration. That's how Philip the Good faced the Brugge Rebellion from 1436 to 1438. Then you have the Revolt of Ghent from 1449 to 1453. Think in the meanwhile how Europe was changing. The latter is the end of the 100 Years' War, and also the fall of Constantinople. So that's the moment in which the Burgundians crush effectively like further Flemish resistance, right, attempts of revolt. At least they have to be careful. They can't squeeze them as much as they want, but at least this was a critical moment in which things could get out of hand, and they resolved the crisis. In both instances, for example, the same Burgundian forces were able to count on support from other Flemish towns. In fact, this is part of the reason why Flanders had fallen to the Burgundians. These towns kind of hated one another. They didn't really have much of a more cohesive sense of themselves. They were admittedly quite rich. They could be that ambitious, but they also really, as all these battles proved, as I was saying in the beginning, that they didn't really have much of a stato culture, right? Something that could go beyond as some sort of even just provincial power. There had been leagues, but they had not quite really worked. Now, following these uprisings, urban liberties were significantly curtailed, as understandably as a consequence of the defeat. Thus, the Burgundian dominance intensified. Consider always this, that Flanders had never been devoid of an actual feudal control, right? There were other areas in Europe that had effectively created other powers that were just of statal size, being recognized by other rulers. This is the case, I don't know, of the Italian principalities, in the Holy Roman Empire. You have, even in France, in this sense, like certain lands that could never simply be united to, but absorbed, say, by the French crown. In that context, this was the case of Burgundy, but not only. Flanders instead remains sort of a hybrid. It goes really nowhere in that institutional development, and if anything, it's the Burgundians instead that conferred them that kind of broader cohesion. It was also relatively loose, also at the end of the period. You have further opposition during the Wars of Liège, again, other defeat of the rebels. It was a series of 3 uprisings led by the Principality of Liège. The reason why this polity rejected both the Burgundian Protectorate and Louis de Bourbon, the nephew of Philip the Good, as their prince bishop, of course, revealed the general ambitions of autonomy of the polity. The rebels were crushed repeatedly on all 3 occasions until Charles the Bold sacked and devastated the town in 1468, which was a major issue at the time, because that shifted the balance properly of power among the centers, like in Flanders, for a long time to come. By the way, these towns were all very competitive. They built like the largest belfries. They wanted to literally tower on one another. For this reason, as we observed before, they would side with the duke or not, that was very happy to play this local differences, was making his power greater. So we can say overall that Philip the Good's reign was especially the most important, like the one in which Burgundy achieved a greater stability, power, the peak of its glory, right? Also, Philip ended up, a bit, with a bit of dementia. But really, all the other reigns were sort of more tormented, let's say. So at the end of Philip's long reign and under the influence of the House of Croy, the Duke of Burgundy grew close to Louis XI of France, that, before becoming king, had been in fact hosted at Philip the Good's court, as he was in conflict against his father. And so that was a great move, like to say, okay, well, there was this inherent, let's say, almost Cold War. It sometimes would escalate. I'm making it simple today, but there were lots of different clashes, especially along the Flemish frontier, to define to whom this or that town belonged, etc. And internationally as well, there were lots of things going on with the English, with Brittany, etc. So hosting the heir of France, like at the Burgundian court, while France was yet to be territorially recomposed, and these conflicts arose, was a quite powerful move. Louis, however, reclaimed the towns of Picardy in the northeast of France, which displeased Charles, the Count of Charolais, the Duke's son and heir. In response, Charles, we were talking about the future Charles the Bold, joined nobiliary revolt against the same king, Louis XI, known as the League of the Public Weal, after which the king returned to the towns of Burgundy, essentially different vassals of the king, in order to prevent such forced acquisitions from the side of the crown sort of arose, and that was the main problem. However, as we'll see, Louis XI's reign, I made a video about him, was the beginning of the territorial recompaction of the Kingdom of France, which passed through the ultimate and de facto bloodless acquisition of the Duchy of Burgundy after the death of Charles the Bold, that the French didn't have the need to destroy, because he destroyed himself against the Swiss. Now, Philip the Good aspired to elevate the Burgundian state already to the status of sovereign kingdom within the Holy Roman Empire. Right? This is really interesting if you think about it, because nobody really thought about anything like that. There was even, as you know, the ancient kingdom of Burgundy that had become some sort of strange abortion, eaten up by the French, and sort of abandoned it by itself by the Holy Roman emperors. But indeed, there was the kingdom of Italy, the kingdom of Bohemia. Italy was mostly just a nominal kingdom, because it was virtually ruled just by the Italian regional states. The kingdom of Bohemia was something more significant at an institutional level, because there was an actual ruler of Bohemia, even though the country at this point was essentially being destroyed, brought back to the Stone Age by the Hussites and all the devastation. That's how eventually the Habsburgs take it over, because literally Bohemia self-destroys itself at that point. But this is just to say that the idea of creating, say, reviving, for example, a sort of Lotharingian power was not anew, right? There had been in Europe this major void between France and Germany that had historically not been directly ruled by anyone until this point, until the Burgundian state developed, exactly exploiting this power vacuum. So an emperor does not have to fear having kingdoms under him, because he really already rules over them. And of course, had the Burgundian state turned into a kingdom, at least, of course, the boundaries would have remained the ones within the Holy Roman Empire, like the Duchy of Burgundy, for example, would have not had to do with that. But there would have been a major, acceleration, at least in the political institutional compaction of such reality. The Burgundian state would have not probably emerged as a major threat to, for example, to the empire, as long, especially as the Germans would have been much more involved with this. It was just like it could have actually even happened, right? That of course the Burgundians would have extended their power further east, which is actually what Charles the Bold was doing. That's also why all the negotiation later on. But it's interesting that Philip the Good thought about this mostly already because of the French threat, right? Philip, going north, envisioned the establishment of Burgundian kingship as a long-term goal requiring meticulous preparation. It wasn't something simply to impose. Especially the Germans would have not liked this as a war. This Lotharingia had remained, again, a power vacuum area that everybody was glad not being filled by anyone. And the Germans were legitimately worried by this. But the Habsburgs were also mostly ruling from the east, so they didn't really... They understood that, at least as a card to, for example, shelter Germany from France and having further power leverage over different kingdoms, etc., could have been really good. At this point, the Habsburgs were not yet so powerful as they would have become in a few decades, also because of the Burgundian inheritance, as a matter of fact. So, but they were also starting to play their diplomatic cards to the end of recompacting their power further. Now, in 1447, Philip the Good engaged in discussion on this topic of the elevation of Burgundy to a kingdom with the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III. That historiography evaluated a bit as a cerebral ruler, not very incisive, etc. He was actually a great player instead. He achieved some major international connections, including the early relations between the Habsburgs and the Iberian monarchies. It's under him, in fact, that also the Habsburgic branches were reunited from the split of the the second half of the 14th century. The emperor at this point was just playing with the Burgundians, right? He merely proposed kingship over a part of the territory. It was a pretty limited one. It is Brabant or Frisia. At least in the case of Brabant, would have covered a great part of, say, Lotharingia, at least as a formal, crown. Frisia was, a bit more difficult to turn into a kingdom, which shows you, in fact, how cautious actually the emperor himself was. This idea for any potential issue that could be sparked. So this disappointed Philip to an extent, but in fact it was not yet this was not properly the natural development of Burgundy to begin with. The dukes wanted this title because they realized that their situation was actually precarious, was too dispersed, and they needed at least some sort of broader international recognition and validation for their dominions compaction. In 1454, Philip traveled to Regensburg, a traditional see of the Reichstag, with the aim of negotiating the Burgundian status. But Frederick did not attend, which is something, as we will see, would be repeated also later. Under Charles, known as the Bold, who succeeded his father, Philip the Good, in 1467. He had already been associated to rule the last couple of years. He was a very energetic figure. Historiography is really depicts him in controversial ways. He was sort of a humoral but also vigorous individual. he wouldn't really have. He had just Mary as a heiress, and as a daughter, and his general policies seem to have been grandiose, but at the end of the day, failing tragically, which is not to be deemed as a futile enterprise, right? Especially the topic of the Burgundian army under Charles the Bold is one of the most attractive, historiographically speaking, because the question is, like, the Burgundians really had the most advanced army in Europe by that point after the Venetian Condotta. And so, like, at least before the rise of the Swiss, that weren't even simply that great power yet, in fact, and they had pretty precarious means, as we explained in the videos about the Swiss. An army like that was expected to beat the Confederates. And instead, as we know, the Burgundian army failed clamorously, but they failed also on other occasions. For example, during the Siege of Neuss, that was an effort to pressure the emperor further to recognize Burgundian power, so threatening Germany from the west to press the Habsburgs to some monarchic recognition. Charles was as ambitious as ruthless. He sought to govern a territorially continuous and independent kingdom reminiscent of old Lotharingia. Remember, he's the one who brought up, again, the idea of the Belgian lion. So he was also fascinated with the kingdoms, actually, as also specified in the relative title when discussing the Kingdom of Arles, in fact, roughly speaking, of Burgundy, and Gallia Belgica. So there was a broader ambition there that was really hanging on so many different historical legacies and cultural projections. Now, by the Treaty of Péronne in October 1468, Louis XI of France removed the French lands of the Duke of Burgundy from the jurisdiction of the Parliament of Paris. This was a major blow to the Valois Burgundy because of essentially the denial of their power. However, the same Louis later opposed this agreement and declared war on the Duke in December 1470. This brought Charles to proclaim both himself and his lands to be forever free from the French crown. So it was definitely a breaking point in these years, showing how France was obviously pressuring the Burgundians to capitulate. They were, at this point, the French were definitely in a better situation than the Burgundians. The only problem is that Burgundy was so big as a whole that you couldn't simply take it over in one shot. You should have been fighting like a major war. You should have counted on so many alignments, right, within the circumstance that were really unpredictable, and that could have actually shipwrecked the same French kingdom. But there wasn't much of an option, at least, to harass Burgundy, right? In fact, Charles was encouraging a resumption of the same 100 Years' War, essentially supporting King Edward IV of York by marrying his sister to him and facilitating Edward's landing in Calais during the summer of 1475. There was essentially an attempt of invasion of France from the side of the English, coordinated with the Burgundians. Charles, however, presented himself without a full army, so that Edward IV, who at that point should have faced the King of France's full might, preferred to sign with the latter the Treaty of Picquigny, that basically put an end to the hostilities, depriving Charles of that card. Things are again more complicated than I'm making it now, but there was a concrete risk of English invasion of France, and so all these powers were perpetually like one step away from collapse and or at least some major destabilization. France was regaining steam. There was no doubt, though, about this. This is why Charles turns again to the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III of Habsburg, with the intention of strengthening ties with him. In November 1473, there is this major display of wealth from the same of Charles that objectively annoyed the Germans. The two sovereigns met in Trier, that was, as you know, it's on the left bank of the Rhine. It's historically, there would be Augusta Treverorum. It was, in fact, the capital of Belgica, right? And therefore a major symbol of that sort of, let's say, more Gallic, Gallo-Burgundian ambition that by this point the Valois Burgundy were fantasizing about. And there was this negotiation for the marriage of Charles' daughter Mary to Frederick's son Maximilian, which would in fact occur. During their meeting, Frederick contemplated having Charles elected as King of the Romans, thus potentially also Emperor, but eventually shifted his focus to reviving the Kingdom of Burgundy. This also shows, by the way, how still relatively distant, well, not much by this point, but still the Habsburgs were from that full consolidation of their own power, right, and international legitimization, like this would mostly occur under Maximilian and with Charles V. So we all know how things went, but it was still on the table to negotiate, of course, a title in Germany, right, or even at a Roman level. The ambition there that mostly Charles was pursuing was establishing a kingdom that would encompass all of the territories within the Burgundian state and include the Duchies of Lorraine, Savoy, and Clèves, as well as the bishoprics of Utrecht, Liège, Toul, and Verdun. So a date of November the 25th, 1473 was even set for Charles' coronation, and even preparations for a crown and scepter were made. However, Frederick abandoned abandoned Trier, right? He fled at night without saying anything. In fact, Charles' emissary reached him on the river by saying, well, why do you want to go? We thought we're doing something about this all. But the truth was that, the emperor wanted just to have some reassurances about the whole situation and still having many cards at his disposal. All right. Maximilian was present, by the way, with Frederick while they were escaping under cover at night. And this enormously frustrated Charles, who had one of his emotional outbursts as a consequence, and really expressed the greater frustration for this possibility of a kingdom that, however, did remain fundamentally just a dream. But that's how close they went to at least formalize it to an extent. And who knows, it's not because of even the creation of this kingdom that, for example, this kingdom had simply to last within imperial institutions. However, had it been achieved, it could have really complicated further the situation in Europe. It could have involved, let's say, the imperial forces more on the French border, even though this is something that was happening ad hoc. And again, that's also what these sovereigns wanted to obtain here. So some room for maneuver, not so potential space, not necessarily dramatic showdowns and whatever. This is what, however, Charles was more interested in because of his vigor and relentless activities, both in the civil and military field, where he was so zealous that, he wanted to reform dramatically administration, functionalize everything. The Flemish, however, were not complying, because there were, to some extent, some sort of positive policies to implement, but just over time and naturally with adequate negotiations, etc. This couldn't really be done immediately. So Charles continued mostly to extend the Burgundian state. He, for example, purchased Brisgau and Sundgau from Sigismund, the Archduke of Austria. This was one of the Habsburgs had not fully recomposed their branches. This was an interesting figure. We shall talk about him. It was immediately evident to anybody in Europe at that point that a recompacted France would have invaded Italy, which is exactly what happened during the Italian Wars. It was sort of the most obvious choice for an hegemonic power in Europe to invade the rich and divided peninsula. That also had a great power on its own, just being fragmented, couldn't fully develop it. And for this reason, there were so many games here with Burgundy, with England. Like, there were now properly continental alliances forming in a way that is really a prelude to the major, mostly anti-French alliances of the modern era. Charles, by the way, takes care of also other lands. He conquered the Duchy of Gelders, the County of Zutphen. Ultimately, in 1475, he captured the Duchy of Lorraine. That was essentially the relic of the older Lotharingia, this in feudal descendancy. Was not so important as, say, Brabant, for example. So it was just mostly completing like the acquisition of many other territories that had remained in between, like the Burgundian ones. This allowed, in fact, to a much thicker territorial recompaction, controlling over a vast continuous area stretching from the Charolais to Friesland. Charles aspired to make the Lorrainer city of Nancy the capital of his kingdom, which is instead dramatically connected with his death. So you understand how tragic of a figure Charles actually was. He was so obsessed with his kingship, really, which he believed he could provide the unity his region so desperately needed. He dressed so extravagantly, like when facing the King of France or the Emperor, because he wanted to present himself as their equal. Everybody thought that he was just really over the line at every level. Right? It was just even a form of disrespect to go like with this extravagant. Like, this was a Burgundian thing, because the court of Burgundy had admittedly become the center of courtly fashion, etc. But here there were some examples that are really excessive. Like, nobody would dress up like that, even a person of that splendor. It's almost like a pre-Raphaelite caricature of medieval power at the time. For example, Charles crafted a golden hat that an Italian observer remarked resembling a king's crown. So if you're negotiating for having one, you don't just go out there show it like that against anyone, right? If you want to be taken seriously. I mean, look at the Habsburgs. They were actually not very rich at all, right? But at least they were real emperors and they didn't need to boast more than actually they would rather instead present themselves in a humbler way than they actually were, to an extent, to signify their own more spiritual nature of power. The territorial ambitions of Valois-Burgundy, however, were scary to many. At this point, as also, for example, the same Louis XI was aware, as the greater power around, Burgundy could not simply be taken out. Right? There had been this state of quasi-war, if even open warfare with France. But the backbone of the Burgundian state could not simply be dislodged from a moment to another. Hadn't it, in fact, self-destroyed? The Swiss confederates at this point were freaking out because the Burgundian state was very close to them. It had been expanding recently, as we've seen, towards their direction. And Burgundy could have actually defeated the Swiss, right? Also, the great defeats of the Burgundian army against the Confederates are to be explained. Of course, in the series, they show that there was something wrong. Not much something wrong with the Burgundian army per se, but let's say with the actually new and sort of futuristic military system that the Confederates had developed, especially as a consequence of their defeat against the Milanese. And they didn't know themselves that they could obtain so much. Switzerland, by the way, was particularly poor, contrary to what it would become. In fact, they didn't have much artillery. Like the Burgundians were overwhelmingly, to say the least, wealthier than anything the Swiss could be at the time. They had this immense means, so legitimately things were, pretty worrying. And this brought, we'll see it better in other videos in detail, to the Burgundian Wars from 1474 to 1477. And so, the story. Charles the Bold's armies experienced two major defeats in 1476 at the battles of Grandson and Mortain. In the process, the Duke of Lorraine, that had sided with the Confederates, recaptured Nancy, taking advantage of the Burgundian setback. And despite having less forces than the beginning of the war, Charles maintained his resolve, aiming at that point to lay siege to Nancy as quickly as possible. And that's where on January the 5th, 1477, he died when his army was crushed by the Swiss and Lorraine. Charles had pretty grim fate, his corpse was found later half devoured by wolves, and in the snow. It was a terrible end. That changed everything in Europe all of a sudden. You can argue that in many ways this is one of the more momentous events in the beginning of the modern era. Because all of a sudden Burgundy found itself without a ruler. Technically it was Mary that, however, as a woman did not have the same authority that at least a male regent, like a husband, could exercise. Even more, the military might of the Burgundian forces was annihilated at this point. So the French didn't really take anything to invade Burgundy, Artois, and Flanders. Louis XI basically took Burgundy all in a shot. That's how he had probably already decided, but let's say that was the moment in which, okay, yes, we can't go out to war because the country is destroyed. We have enough force to take it over. Mary, at this point, was in the north. So Flanders was invaded as well. Burgundy was lost. This is the moment in which basically nobody recovered Burgundy from the heirs of its legacy. Burgundy at this point also enters probably the domain of the French crown, so it's absorbed. It ceases to be an effective state on its own. Mary summons the States General of the Low Countries. Naturally, she was displeased with the actions of her late father, especially she at that point was forced, because of them, to concede the Great Privilege, which basically dissolved several centralized institutions that the Valois Burgundy had worked to obtain with great effort. And so this tells you how close, like, just everything was to collapse, right? Just of powers at the time, not just for Burgundy, but this one in particular, because it was held together by the deterrence of an army that now disappeared, and especially also the position of Mary. This meant, by the way, that many local communities in these general estates restored their local communal rights. Nevertheless, they weren't really. This is the sort of weird, of course, behavior that many people have in time of crisis. Like, they regain immediately what they can get, a sort of short, medium term. But of course they freak out because now they are without protection as well. The French are at the gates. And so they urge Mary to marry Maximilian of Austria, as it had already been prevented by her father. And the marriage was eventually held in Ghent as soon as August 19, 1477. That's how urgent the situation was. This is what brings to the victory, the first final victory against the French at Guinegate in 1479. Basically, Maximilian arrived in the Low Countries, so boasting the title of Duke of Burgundy, even though the Duchy of Burgundy had been lost to the French. Vaux, however, now could not simply go full war against the Habsburgs. They were supported, of course, by the Flemish, given the quite warring situation, the emergential situation for them. Maximilian tried through Swiss contractors that he had hired, which is also interesting because, of course, the Habsburgs themselves had suffered defeats at the hand of the Swiss. They had lost part of their ancestral lands. Due to that, we will talk more about those battles. They were very important and fascinating. And he tried, that from the video on the Landsknechten, that Maximilian is the guy who, in fact, creates this German way to pike warfare that the Swiss were mastering at this point. In fact, the Landsknechten would become not just like the imperial army, like the imperial force, as a stattal force, let's say, a servant of the land, but also fierce rivals of the Swiss. Maximilian wants essentially to carry out a military reform in Flanders with these contractors, but the Flemish are not the type of country that can sustain or afford that, right? They're all communes. They don't have like that stattal background. Yes, the Burgundians have profiled them as a sort of more or less now conglomerated polity, but there are no preconditions for that achievement. So that at Guinegate, basically, the Flemish with the Habsburgs barely win, right, against the French that have in fact to back down temporarily. But there is no major reform, and actually the Flemish didn't like any one of those who ruled over them. They didn't like the Habsburgs as they didn't like the French, especially now without that massive Burgundian power. Like, they felt like, oh my god, we have so much autonomy, except again they now were squeezed among even bigger powers as they were profiling on the European horizon. Mary dies suddenly in 1482. In fact, she has a horseback riding accident. It was not good for Maximilian. You would think that he would simply inherit everything just per se, or at least for his 3-year-old son, Philip the Fair, would become the king of Spain, etc., through the same mechanism. You see, the Habsburgs had learned how to do that, marry the heiress of that king, in the case of the Catholic kings of Spain. But the people liked Mary. At least she was really the sort of the true biological chain with the late Charles. And Maximilian was just a foreigner of some sort, so that her death complicates the situation for Maximilian in the rule of the Netherlands. There is the Treaty of Arras, signed in December 1482, which arranges a marriage between Maximilian's daughter Margaret with the 12-year-old Dauphin Charles. This was essentially a settlement to avoid full-scale confrontation, because nor France nor the Habsburgs had really the means to be at prolonged war against one another in this circumstance. France had much to prepare itself for. At this point, they were already looking at different horizons themselves. France had been pursuing the northeastern policy of reacquisition of Flanders that was technically as the whole county. There is a part of Flanders that actually lays in the Holy Roman Empire, but Flanders was one of the principalities of the Western Frankish kingdom since Carolingian time. So since Philip IV, the northeastern frontier had been the most important. And again, this would continue over and over, like during the late Italian wars, throughout all the, think about the age of Louis XIV, same to an extent. This is true for the same Napoleonic era. There's always this knot, this frontier, these countries that have coagulated historically, apparently out of no particular divide, because they were essentially the product of a feudal state building, that in this case, in fact, the Burgundians had specifically been the direct authors of. And so the Burgundy Habsburgs now retained control over Flanders and the remaining territories of the Netherlands, which were imperial estates, so at least as Holy Roman emperors, were theirs to take. France remains with this major acquisition of the Duchy of Burgundy, but also Artois and Picardy that had been essentially also conquered in arms, along with the County of Burgundy, however, only as Margaret's dowry, because the County of Burgundy is another thing. It had been controlled by the Burgundian state, especially in the later times, but it was on the imperial side, right? If you watch that video about the Duchy of Burgundy, you understand how in the 10th and 11th century, the Duchy and the County of Burgundy had split, right? Also together properly from the Kingdom of Burgundy, and so this broader area that was known of as Burgundy, I think, because of the Romano-Germanic kingdom that essentially evolved as the Kingdom of Ireland, also in the Holy Roman Empire, but was essentially a failed state. These territories would notoriously be contended also between Charles V, Francis I during the Italian Wars. There's various settlements, treatises, especially about the Battle of Pavia when Francis I was captured by Charles, and so there was this initial formal recognition that the Habsburgs could recover certain lands. Because, by the way, at some point, Francis would recognize St. Charles as a vassal, right? Because of the Burgundian legacy and inheritance, which was, however, sort of an insult, because, of course, Charles was the Holy Roman Emperor. In theory, that was more even important than should have been at least more important than the King of France. So there is all that quite complicated story that, however, we do not cover because we stopped to early modern time, at the thresholds of the modern era. The Dauphin of the marriage with Margaret was the future Charles VIII. So the same one who started the Italian Wars and confronted, in fact, the Imperials in the same Italy. the Dauphin chose, in the moment in which he was crowned, he became king, to marry, however, Anne of Brittany, who in turn had also previously been married by proxy to Maximilian. Was yet another issue, because Brittany was the next major acquisition of the French monarchy. Would occur in actually a pretty long time, but at least from a dynastic point of view, they achieved it at this point. By the Treaty of Senlis in 1493, the French king returned Artois, Charolais, and the County of Burgundy to the emperor. Later, with the Treaty of Cambrai, where in 1529, Francis I of France renounces his claims to Artois and Flanders, which also in a historical perspective were, an important loss. What was really given in exchange from the side of Charles V was the relinquishment of his claim to the Duchy of Burgundy, so that there wouldn't be this embarrassment anymore of the fact that, because you see, the Duchy was ruled by the French, but Charles could really boast the title because he was the legitimate heir. And so they settled this matter by essentially, okay, Burgundy was lost anyway. The Imperials didn't really have much power at that point, at least to invade France and obtain any major deal. With that concession, you could reinforce the northeastern, say at least from the Habsburg side, northwestern frontier in the Netherlands. The Habsburgs, as you know, they carried out a broader political, say, administrative and juridical reform of the imperial Kreis. And so in 1512, the Burgundian Circle was established as an imperial one within the Holy Roman Empire. This is essentially a provincial district of the empire, which reaffirms, in fact, the Habsburgic rights to the Burgundian inheritance, in this sense more than against the French, that was also a thing, but also within the same Germany, to say that's technically our land. As you know, that land will go actually to the Spanish, so it wasn't much of an Austrian thing at a point, but that was also because of another reason. What is interesting about the Burgundian Kreis is that it was territorially discontinuous. I think just the Upper Rhenish one was discontinuous, but this is not so important. But the Burgundian one was discontinuous because it controlled Holland, Flanders, Brabant, Luxembourg, and the county of Burgundy that was further south, right between Lorraine and Savoy. And so, there's this sort of very careful redrawing of sort of the political map of Germany as far as the imperial administration was concerned. Essentially, the Franche Comté at that point was united with the Habsburgic Netherlands. Then there were various other passages, such as the Wars of Gelders, where further territories were incorporated into the Burgundian states, including Friesland, Frisia, Utrecht, Overijssel, Groningen, the County of Zutphen, the Duchy of Gelders. This had, in part, as we've seen, already been, in fact, part of, the Burgundian state, but only now the Habsburgs properly include them formally within also the German administration. In 1549, Charles V enacts the Pragmatic Sanction, which organizes the Burgundian Low Countries into 17 provinces, which is a name that you know, because these are eventually the ones over which the control of the land is fought during the Dutch Revolt, right? So that a part remains with the Spanish, roughly today is Belgium, and the other is the United Provinces, roughly today, the Netherlands today. Now, the Franche-Comté was ceded to France by Spain in the Treaty of Nijmegen. We are at the time of Louis XIV. And so during the 18th century, there is also the passage from, in fact, the Spanish to the Austrian possession, then in the late 18th century, the French reconquer part of the Low Countries. So again, we get to Napoleon, the Belgian Revolution, all what occurred. But to make you understand how these states in Europe today, quite representative, quite famous ones in global culture, like came fundamentally out as a consequence of what the Burgundian states had been and how they had been built, right? Which is, in many ways, you could say the result of this majorly unsettled issue of how do we actually, like it's not until the say it's from the Carolingian Empire that these territories had not been united, and they still aren't, by the way, in a contiguous way, in a uniform fashion, right? And the major issue had been who was controlling them before. Like for a very long time, there wasn't properly a single, say, provincial regional power that controlled, say, more or less today's Benelux. The only one was truly the Burgundian state, that, however, existed in a time in which still, in fact, the concept of state, as we said at the beginning, did not exist, at least in the case of probably what the Burgundian domains really were. So I'm always glad when I make these videos, because I feel that in spite of the, say, more in-depth content, is somehow more interesting, depending, of course, also what it is. It's incredibly crucial in order to speak history, to lay, like, properly the most important foundations of, like, what was, in fact, these major powers at a point in European history, to say, what were they really? Like, how did they come about? Why did they even exist, right? And how should we frame them? So, and I think, I hope at least that these videos can help framing the topic better. Like, this is major. I liked it because, as you know, I covered mostly in the same region, lots of French or German principalities. Also, in fact, ones of the Low Countries that technically belonged either to one or the other. I mean, if you look at the Wallonians, the Flemish, basically we're talking the French and the Germans, at least in a broader national, modern national sense of approximation. But they equally, like, deserve, in fact, this consideration. Otherwise, you can't really even understand what the map of Europe, why the map of Europe looks the same does today. So I was checking medieval Burgundy here. I really threw everything into it, from the Kingdom of Arles to the ancient Burgundians. So I should create another one to make a bit more order. But I'm glad, because it's only 18 videos. Well, only considering the whole mass. It got 744 views. This was an old playlist, admittedly, so it's not such an enormous amount. Of course, the single videos get more views than that. But it's a way to start. It's a way to start. You couldn't. Here, the last we talked about the Dauphiné. In fact, smaller entities like that, aside from the Kingdom of Burgundy. Just recently talked about Savoy. There's another chunk of that. And so, yeah, sometimes I make more in-depth videos about the smaller politics than the bigger ones, but for the Middle Ages, it passes largely through the fact that, in fact, the bigger ones were often, in fact, more like the product of, so the sum of these little ones, rather than fully fledged, like, overarching power of the same. So it's interesting to see how things really develop in this direction for the channel. Uh, I can't say that we're ending the European politics to cover, telling the truth. I could pass to the modern age that I know would please many of you, because that's also a way to make sense of a much larger part of European history is often neglected. But yeah, there is a lot. For Germany, at least to the degree because I could make a video about every single thing, right? Even individual cities. I mean, in the case of city-states, you understand that, but say, I don't know, I think there is Bruges coming on unexpectedly, but I could focus on Cologne, which is sort of different. Just an example, think from the Principality of Cologne, the ecclesiastical. There's so much in that sense, but it should also be a power provided with an actual relevance at a bigger level, so we can talk at length about, especially an autonomous political and military activity you can track to make a video on. Otherwise, of course, you can always go more in depth, but it's not like you just think about the Archbishopric of Cologne as, even though it was incredibly powerful as like a unitary power we want to describe in a regional series, right? It's something different and complicated. So Germany is actually almost finished. I have to do still several more videos actually, but for the Middle Ages, most of it is covered. So from there, we should also move geographically, because or invent some other issue, like, I don't know, a monarchic series. I don't know. We will see this. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.